big shot right here that's coming out here. He got up and conducted the school choir on his first day.
At first glance, Steve Harvey's life seems like the blueprint of the American dream. A man who rose from poverty to become one of the most recognizable faces in television, hosting everything from Family Feud to his own talk shows, all while dressing sharp and making millions laugh with that booming, unforgettable laugh. But behind the bright lights and the stage smiles, there is another story. A story marked by heartbreak, controversy, loss, and sacrifices that almost broke him. Now at 68, when most people might be slowing down to enjoy the fruits of their labor, Steve Harvey carries the weight of scars that the cameras never capture. His journey from sleeping in his car to standing at the top of Hollywood was paved with family turmoil, public humiliation, financial struggles, and health battles. It is a story that proves fame and fortune do not erase pain. In fact, sometimes they magnify it. This is the heartbreaking truth about Steve Harvey at 68. Steve Harvey's life began far away from the glamorous stages he would one day command. Born Broderick Stephen Harvey in Welch, West Virginia, in 1957, his early years were defined by poverty, hardship, and the cruel realities of growing up black in the segregated South. His father, a coal miner, worked grueling hours underground to keep food on the table, while his mother did everything she could to raise her children with faith and discipline. But money was scarce, and dreams seemed even scarcer. As a boy, Steve developed a severe stutter that turned him into an easy target for bullies. Every time he tried to speak in class, words would catch in his throat, tumbling out in broken syllables that made classmates laugh, and even some teachers dismiss him as slow. That humiliation left scars that cut deep, and young Steve often came home in tears, questioning whether he would ever be able to communicate clearly with the world around him. Yet, instead of breaking him, those struggles began shaping the entertainer he would later become. At home, Steve would try to hide his pain behind jokes, discovering that humor was his shield, the one thing that made people forget his speech impediment and focus on his charm. Still, the reality was bleak. Growing up in a cramped house with little money, Steve and his siblings wore hand-me-down clothes and often went without basic necessities. His father's job in the mines was dangerous, and every day the family lived with the quiet fear that he might not return home. Meanwhile, racism and limited opportunities for black families in their small community meant Steve had few role models who showed him a way out. Yet even in those dark circumstances, a seed of ambition was planted. Steve wrote a note in school declaring that one day he would be on television, a dream so outlandish that his teacher laughed and even punished him for what she saw as arrogance. Instead of discouraging him, that moment lit a fire. He carried that dream with him, holding on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, his future wouldn't look like his present. His family later moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where the environment was still harsh but offered more opportunities. There, Steve's stutter slowly began to improve as he worked tirelessly to train his voice, often practicing in front of a mirror or repeating words until he mastered their rhythm. He idolized performers who could captivate audiences effortlessly and promised himself that one day he would stand on a stage and command attention not through fear or ridicule, but through laughter and respect. Despite his growing determination, life didn't suddenly get easier. As a teenager, Steve worked a string of odd jobs, cleaning, repairing, even working on a factory floor, just to support himself. Each job paid little, but it instilled in him a relentless work ethic. Deep down, though, the wounds of poverty and ridicule stayed with him. He never forgot the sting of being underestimated, of being told he would never amount to anything. Those memories followed him into adulthood, becoming both a source of pain and a driving force behind his ambition. Looking back, Steve often admits that his toughest battles were not on stage or in front of the camera. They were in those classrooms, on those playgrounds, and inside his own mind when he doubted himself the most. The tragedy of his childhood wasn't just financial hardship. It was the deep loneliness of a boy who wanted to be heard, but struggled to find his voice. And yet, that very struggle gave birth to the man who would one day use that same voice to inspire millions. When Steve Harvey finally decided to chase comedy, it was not a glamorous leap, but a desperate gamble. He was already a grown man, working odd jobs to keep himself afloat. Mailman, carpet cleaner, insurance salesman, none of which satisfied his restless spirit. The idea of stepping onto a stage terrified him, but deep down, he knew he couldn't keep ignoring the dream that had lived in him since childhood. His first stand-up set was shaky, but when the audience laughed, even for a moment, Steve felt a power he had never experienced before. That rush became an addiction, and soon he was driving hundreds of miles, sleeping in his car, and scraping together every cent just to perform at dingy clubs where the pay barely covered gas money. For years, Steve lived on the edge of survival. He has openly admitted that he spent stretches of time homeless, washing up in gas station bathrooms and eating fast food scraps because he couldn't afford proper meals. He would park his beat-up car near gigs, change clothes in the back seat, and then walk into comedy clubs with a forced smile, hiding the fact that he had nowhere else to go when the lights went off. That period of homelessness lasted for 3 years, a brutal sacrifice that strained every part of his life. His first marriage collapsed under the pressure. With little money and endless nights away from home, his wife felt abandoned, and Steve's children grew up with their father's presence reduced to phone calls and broken promises. It was the tragic cost of ambition. The closer he got to making people laugh on stage, the further he drifted from his own family. Steve later confessed that one of his greatest regrets was not being there for his kids during those formative years. He was consumed by comedy, driven by the belief that if he just endured a little more suffering, the breakthrough would come. But the guilt haunted him, and it never truly went away. Even as his career began to build momentum, he carried the weight of those broken relationships. Beyond family, Steve's finances were in ruins. He would often leave gigs with less money than he had when he arrived. Some nights he walked away unpaid, with promoters taking advantage of his desperation. The humiliation of pouring his heart into a performance only to be dismissed by shady club owners cut deeply. But Steve was too stubborn to quit. He often slept in his car outside the very clubs he had just performed in, dreaming of the day when he wouldn't have to beg for stage time. That perseverance eventually paid off, but it came at a tremendous emotional price. Friends who had started the journey with him gave up along the way, finding steadier jobs and leaving comedy behind. Steve watched them move into stable homes and provide for their families, while he still battled with hunger and homelessness. In his darkest moments, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake, if he was sacrificing everything for a dream that might never come true. Yet, every time he walked on stage and heard laughter fill the room, he found the strength to keep going. Those years shaped him into a relentless performer. But they also scarred him. They hardened his heart and made him wary of trust, for he had seen how quickly people walked away when life got difficult. They left him with estranged children, failed marriages, and a reputation among some as a man who chose fame over family. And even though Steve would one day climb to unimaginable heights, the pain of those years never left him. At 68, He still looks back at that period as both the making and breaking of him. The years that gave him his career, but stole from him pieces of his soul that he could never get back. By the late 1990s, after years of struggle, Steve Harvey had finally clawed his way into the spotlight. His hard work and relentless grind were paying off. He landed a sitcom, The Steve Harvey Show, which ran for 6 successful seasons and made him a household name. His stand-up career also exploded with the iconic Kings of Comedy tour, alongside Cedric the Entertainer, D.L. Hewley, and Bernie Mac. The tour became one of the highest-grossing comedy tours in history, cementing Steve's place among the giants of the craft. On the surface, it looked like everything he had endured had finally been worth it. He was famous, respected, and wealthy. But behind the applause and television success, another story was playing out. One filled with broken relationships, regrets, and a man struggling to balance his personal life with his professional ascent. Steve's second marriage was already showing cracks, strained under the pressures of his career. The endless traveling, long filming schedules, and obsession with building an empire left little room for intimacy or stability. He had learned how to make millions of fans laugh, but he couldn't seem to stop his own home from crumbling. Divorce became yet another chapter in his story, with bitter disputes and custody battles that would continue to follow him for years. His children often spoke of feeling abandoned, watching their father provide for the world, but not always for them. That guilt lingered heavily over Steve, who later admitted that fame had made him miss some of the most important moments in their lives. Financially, success also brought new problems. For a man who once had nothing, sudden wealth came with temptations and bad decisions. Steve trusted the wrong people to manage his money, which later led to devastating tax issues that nearly destroyed him. At one point, he discovered that his accountant had stolen millions, leaving him facing enormous debts to the IRS despite his television success. The betrayal left him broken and forced him to start over financially at an age when most men were preparing for retirement. Emotionally, the strain was taking its toll. Steve worked non-stop, hosting, touring, filming, and chasing new opportunities in an attempt to build security that had always eluded him in his younger years. But the more he achieved, the more he seemed to lose pieces of himself. Friends recalled that during this period, Steve often appeared exhausted, his trademark laugh masking the toll of carrying so much on his shoulders. His body began to show the wear of constant stress, with health scares and fatigue forcing him to confront the fact that he wasn't invincible. What made it more tragic was that even in his greatest moments of triumph, Steve felt a gnawing emptiness. He had finally reached the dream he had scribbled on that school note as a boy: to be on television, to be famous. But the cost had been immense. 2 marriages had failed. His children had grown up with a father who was more myth than man. He had been robbed by those he trusted, and the loneliness of his sacrifices often crept in during quiet nights in hotel rooms after the crowd's applause had faded. Steve Harvey's success was undeniable, but the price he paid for it was staggering. For every laugh he earned, there was a tear shed in private. For every deal signed, there was a relationship lost. And though the world saw him as a man who had it all, Steve himself knew that his victories were built on a foundation of pain. The tragedy of his life wasn't just in the hardships he endured before fame. It was in the painful reality that even achieving everything he had dreamed of still left him searching for peace. At the height of his fame, Steve Harvey seemed untouchable. He had become a staple on television, with his sitcom reruns still loved by fans, his stand-up legacy secured, and new ventures opening doors in radio and daytime talk shows. But as his profile grew larger, so did the scrutiny. Suddenly, the The man who once fought tooth and nail just to be seen was now fighting to keep his reputation intact. The most infamous controversy came in 2015 during the Miss Universe pageant, when Steve, serving as host, mistakenly announced the wrong winner. In front of millions of viewers worldwide, he crowned Miss Colombia instead of Miss Philippines, only to return moments later to awkwardly correct himself. The blunder sparked international outrage, spawning endless memes, harsh criticism, and even threats. Though Steve apologized, the humiliation haunted him. For a man who prided himself on professionalism, the incident was a public nightmare that nearly overshadowed his decades of hard work. Yet this wasn't the only controversy. His self-help books and relationship advice, particularly Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man, became bestsellers, but also drew fire. Critics accused him of pushing outdated gender roles and oversimplifying the complex realities of modern relationships. Some said he used his platform to shame women, while others felt his advice was self-serving and hypocritical given his own history of failed marriages. Steve defended his views passionately, but the backlash chipped away at the image of him as simply a family-friendly comedian. As his talk shows and radio programs expanded, so did his tendency to make off-the-cuff remarks that landed him in hot water. At times, his jokes were called insensitive, and his comments about politics and race drew sharp criticism. In one instance, he was accused of mocking Asian men during a comedy bit, sparking outrage and forcing him to issue a public apology. Each controversy painted a more complicated picture of Steve Harvey. Not just a man beloved for his humor, but also a figure capable of igniting anger and disappointment. On top of the public missteps, Steve faced professional backlash as well. Despite his popularity, several of his shows were canceled, including The Steve Harvey Show on NBC and Little Big Shots, leaving many to speculate if the controversies had tarnished his brand. Rumors of behind-the-scenes tension and reports of him being difficult to work with also emerged, further feeding negative headlines. For a man who had once fought simply to survive, this kind of public attack cut deeply. Steve admitted in interviews that the pressure of constant criticism weighed heavily on him, leading to sleepless nights and feelings of isolation. He leaned heavily on his faith to get through, but even prayer could not erase the sting of being ridiculed by the same audiences he worked so hard to entertain. The heartbreaking reality was that Steve's greatest strength, his ability to connect with millions, was also his greatest weakness. The bigger his platform, the bigger the target on his back. Every misstep was amplified, every flaw magnified, until the man who had once just wanted to make people laugh became a polarizing figure in the media. At 68, these controversies still follow him, a reminder that fame offers no escape from criticism. For Steve Harvey, the tragedy wasn't just in making mistakes. It was in realizing that no matter how much success he achieved, he would always be one headline away from being torn apart by the very public that once lifted him up. If there is one area of Steve Harvey's life that has carried the most visible scars, it is his family. Behind the laughter, success, and polished image of a man who seems to have everything lies a story of fractured relationships, bitter disputes, and years of heartbreak that money and fame could not fix. Steve has been married 3 times, and each marriage has left its mark on him and his children. His first marriage, during the years when he was still struggling to establish his comedy career, ended in divorce after he spent more time on the road than at home. The financial instability, coupled with the pressures of chasing fame, tore at the foundation of his family life. His children from that marriage often grew up feeling like their father belonged to the world more than he belonged to them. That sense of absence created emotional wounds that would resurface later in life. leaving Steve carrying the heavy burden of regret. His second marriage seemed to promise more stability, but it turned out to be another chapter of turmoil. The relationship was plagued with accusations, disputes, and eventually a bitter divorce that spilled into the public eye. His ex-wife, Mary Vaughn, accused him of infidelity, abuse, and neglect, sparking a storm of headlines that painted Steve in a harsh light. Courtroom battles ensued, with Mary filing lawsuits and alleging that Steve had left her financially and emotionally devastated. While many of those claims were later dismissed by the courts, the damage to his image, and more importantly, his family relationships, was undeniable. His son from that marriage, Winton, often found himself caught in the middle of a war between two parents, a tragedy that no amount of fame could erase. The custody disputes, financial battles, and public accusations left deep scars that affected not only Steve, but also his children, who had to watch their family life become tabloid fodder. When Steve eventually married Marjorie, the woman he often describes as the love of his life, it seemed like he had finally found stability. Together they built a blended family, with Marjorie's children from previous relationships becoming part of Steve's household. But even here, controversies followed. Critics accused Steve of abandoning his older children to focus on his new family. Others questioned Marjorie's past, spreading rumors about her alleged ties to questionable figures before meeting Steve. While Steve publicly defended his wife and insisted that his family was united, whispers of division and resentment continued to follow them. His children from his earlier marriages sometimes hinted at strained relationships with their father, with some expressing frustration at feeling overshadowed by the glamorous lifestyle Steve built with Marjorie. Even today, there are constant rumors about tension within the Harvey family, with tabloid stories of potential divorces, estrangement, and fractured bonds. Whether true or not, the consistency of these stories underscores a painful reality. Steve's family life has been anything but smooth. The tragedy lies in the fact that while Steve built an empire on family-friendly humor and advice, his own family often reflected chaos and pain. He has admitted in interviews that one of his deepest regrets is not being able to protect his children from the fallout of his decisions and the bitterness of his failed marriages. At 68, Steve Harvey can look back at a life of immense professional success. But when it comes to his family, the story is far more complicated. The laughter he gave to the world came at the cost of tears within his own home. And for a man who values his role as a father, that is a heartbreak that no amount of wealth or fame could ever heal. By the time Steve Harvey reached his 60s, the pace of his career was something that would have exhausted even a man half his age. He juggled multiple shows at once: Family Feud, Celebrity Family Feud, his syndicated radio program, The Steve Harvey Morning Show, a daytime talk show, pageants, and countless appearances across the globe. His schedule was relentless, with early mornings, late nights, and constant travel that left little time for rest. For years, Steve prided himself on outworking everyone around him, insisting that his drive was what pulled him from homelessness to stardom. But that same drive began to wear his body down. Though Steve has often kept the details private, whispers of health scares and visible signs of exhaustion followed him. There were times when fans noticed him looking thinner and more fatigued than usual, sparking rumors about his well-being. Reports surfaced about him quietly dealing with high blood pressure and stress-related complications, issues not uncommon for a man his age, especially one carrying such a demanding workload. The weight of running an empire also meant Steve often worked through illness and fatigue, refusing to slow down for fear of losing everything he had fought for. On his radio show, he would sometimes joke about not sleeping much, But behind the jokes was a man who pushed his body to the brink. Friends and colleagues described him as exhausted, often running on fumes just to keep up appearances. The stress of lawsuits, tax troubles, family, disputes, and the constant pressure of maintaining his brand added even more strain. There were times Steve himself admitted that the pressure felt unbearable, confessing in candid moments that he was tired of fighting battles on every front. On top of physical exhaustion, the toll on his mental health was equally heavy. Living under the scrutiny of the public eye meant every rumor, every controversy, and every family issue became magnified, leaving Steve in a constant state of defense. The need to protect his legacy while also providing for his family weighed on him daily. Even when health concerns forced him to slow down, he rarely allowed himself more than a brief pause before diving back into work, fearful that stepping away would undo decades of progress. For a man who had once lived out of his car, the thought of losing it all again was his worst nightmare, and that fear drove him harder than ever. Yet, that same fear also became part of the tragedy. Instead of enjoying the rewards of his success, Steve often found himself chained to the very empire he built, unable to rest. At 68, most men begin preparing for retirement, spending time with grandchildren and reflecting on their life's work. But Steve Harvey continues to push forward, his health an unspoken concern lingering in the background. The relentless years of grinding, the sleepless nights, the stress of being both a provider and a brand. These have left marks on him that no camera can hide. The heartbreaking truth is that Steve Harvey's body has carried the burden of decades of sacrifice. And while he still puts on the sharp suits and the booming laugh, behind the stage lights is a man who has been worn down by exhaustion, fighting battles that the world rarely sees. For decades, Steve Harvey has been celebrated as the man with the dazzling smile, the quick wit, and the ability to make millions laugh. On camera, he radiates confidence, charm, and authority. Whether he is hosting a game show, giving relationship advice, or delivering motivational speeches. But behind that larger-than-life personality lies a man who has often battled with private demons. Steve has admitted in interviews that despite all his success, there were many nights when he cried himself to sleep, weighed down by regrets, loneliness, and the feeling that he was carrying burdens too heavy for one man. His faith in God has always been his anchor, and Steve frequently credits prayer as the reason he survived the storms of his life. Yet even with his faith, there were moments of deep depression, when the laughter he gave to others felt like a cruel mask hiding his own sorrow. He once confessed that the weight of failed marriages, broken trust, and financial ruin pushed him to the edge, and it was only by holding on to his belief that God had a purpose for him that he avoided giving up completely. Those close to Steve have described him as a man who often isolates himself when the cameras turn off. Despite being surrounded by fans, colleagues, and family, he sometimes retreats into solitude, wrestling with the shadows of his past. The image of Steve Harvey as a flawless success story has always been complicated by the truth. His journey left him scarred, and he never fully healed. The constant pressure to be on for the public, to always be funny, always be inspiring, always be perfect, became both his greatest strength and his greatest prison. Fans saw the smile, but they did not see the moments of exhaustion when Steve questioned if he was truly happy. They did not see the private doubts about whether he had been a good enough father or whether the choices he made in pursuit of fame had cost him too much. Adding to the heartbreak is the contradiction that defines Steve Harvey's life. He is a man who has counseled millions through his books and speeches, telling them to chase their dreams, mend their families, and build their faith. Yet he himself has struggled with broken relationships, estranged children, and nights when his own advice failed to bring him peace. His career is built on humor, but much of that humor came from pain. His sharpest jokes were often born from the hardest chapters of his life. At 68, the mask he wears in public has become second nature, but the toll of carrying it for so long is undeniable. For every laugh he gives, there is a moment of silence when the cameras stop rolling and the smile fades into something far more fragile. The tragedy of Steve Harvey is not just in the struggles he endured, but in the duality of his existence, the man who could make the world laugh while quietly weeping in the shadows of his own heart. At 68, Steve Harvey stands as both a triumph and a tragedy, a man who rose from poverty and ridicule to become one of the most recognizable entertainers in the world, yet one who carries the scars of every sacrifice he made along the way. His legacy is undeniable. From stand-up stages to primetime television, from best-selling books to motivational speeches, he has influenced millions and carved his name into the history of comedy and broadcasting. But when the spotlight dims, the truth of his life tells a more complicated story. The boy who once stuttered his way through ridicule grew into a man whose voice could command arenas. Yet that same voice often struggled to heal the fractures within his own home. The man who became a symbol of perseverance and faith also faced heartbreak in divorces, estrangement, lawsuits, and public humiliation. The entertainer who made millions laugh often wrestled with tears when the cameras turned off, wondering if the cost of his empire was simply too high. Health scares and exhaustion remind him that even legends are mortal, and time is no longer on his side. Yet through all of it, Steve Harvey's resilience has remained. He continues to dress sharp, step on stage, and tell the world to never stop believing. Even when his own journey proves how heavy that belief can be. The heartbreaking truth of Steve Harvey's life is that greatness and pain have walked hand in hand with him for decades. He has built an empire of laughter, but it came at the expense of broken families, sleepless nights, and wounds that never fully healed. At 68, his story is both inspiring and tragic, a reminder that success does not erase suffering, and behind every smile can be a lifetime of silent battles. Steve Harvey's legacy will forever be that of a man who made the world laugh, even when his own heart was breaking.